Hi, it's Simon here from Analog Anorak, and today I'm going to be doing a vintage shootout between these two records I picked up quite a few years ago from the same shop actually, and you can sort of see already from the appearance that this one is an original 1959 mono of Shostakovich Martinon. And this is the stereo, the living stereo, again from 1959 original release, and it's a good opportunity to do a shootout. Probably, unless you've got a time machine, probably not as much relevant as some of the shootouts that are on the net. What's interesting about doing a like-for-like comparison is unlike some of the shootouts where mono cartridges aren't available, or the stereo version is a re-release with the advantage of much finer technology. This gives a real good understanding, a nice snapshot of how these two compared during the early days of stereo. Just to explain, although these records are RCA records, the bulk of the actual the actual recording session that was carried out by Decca staff and by Decca, and using Decca techniques and equipment, including for the stereo, the Decca tree. But also for these particular versions I've got, they were actually produced in the UK in 1959, released about the same time as the American versions, using the Decca mastering engineers and the presses as well. And this sort of arrangement started from about 1957. It was an agreement with RCA in the US that essentially meant that Decca took over production of all the RCA records from HMV, and the advantage for RCA was with this agreement that it enabled them to get access to the Decca venues and recording staff in London, but also in Paris, in various venues in Italy and in Vienna. At the time the agreement took place, most of the records that were being produced and being sold were mono. RCA wanted to take advantage of the great results that Decca were getting by this time with mono. Both of the companies were working on stereo arriving in the next few years, and this is why it's quite interesting to look at in detail at some of the records during this period, because you get a sense of how things were developing with skills and techniques and the end result. I'm hopefully going to do a few of these videos with similar pairs of mono and stereo releases. The other records are pretty identical as far as the sound quality of the records, and it's not the same with this RCA, because unfortunately the stereo record, it's got a bit more distracting surface noise all the way through. I'm going to be using two turntables. For the mono, to get the best results, I'm using my Miyajima Quartetto cartridge on my Lenco idler drive. But the stereo cart that I use on that, it just picks up too much distracting surface noise. So for this, I have used my old modified Technics 1200 with a Dynavector 10x5 high output cartridge. I found that particular cartridge worked best with this record, because it just seems to get the right balance between getting the most musicality out of these grooves, and it's still there, but while minimizing the distraction of the surface noise. The other thing that I'm going to be talking about is what was happening around the time that the recording session took place in '57 and the actual time when these records came out in 1959, because there were further really quite interesting changes going on. It's really been helpful to utilize information from a brilliant database that's free online called the Charm database. It gives a lot of detail about the recording sessions, the actual records that were produced, and the people who were involved. As far as the actual techniques and equipment used, I've again been very reliant on the information provided by Michael Gray, some of which is available on the net. Others has come from the booklets that he's produced for 3 really fascinating box sets on CD. I will also talk a little bit about possible options for trying to get hold of this record. My information is mainly sort of UK based, but it does sound like it is a tricky time to get a hold of this recording without really paying a significant amount of money if you're after that vintage tubey sound. I want to talk about the recording session first, which took place between the 9th and the 11th of December 1957 at Decca's preferred recording venue, which was Kingsway Hall. At the time of this session, there were still 2 distinct teams and equipment involved for the mono versions and the stereo versions. Quite often there were separate producers as well between the mono and the stereo team, but sometimes one producer oversaw both versions. The Shostakovich session was overseen by one producer, James Walker, who over the previous 2 years, mainly in Geneva, had developed quite significant experience in working with 2 teams between mono and stereo. Both of the recording engineers on this session were relatively new. They were part of a big influx of staff who were recruited to Decca as Decca took on more jobs and more obligations, such as taking over the RCA contract, and they later took over a subsidiary called Argo, and they also thought it was very likely that they would be producing significant amounts of stereo records alongside people who were happy to stick with mono. During the preceding 12 months in Kingsway, they'd really started to get good results with stereo. This had led to some quite legendary recordings, quite a few which were released by RCA and were very popular. It's said that there was a circular passed around to the Decca staff from on high, hinting that perhaps they shouldn't be trying quite so hard for RCA. This was totally ignored by the Decca staff involved. Mono recording engineer on this session was James Timms, and as far as I can see on the Charm database, this was the first session he actually headed. In contrast, the stereo session was done by a man called Reeve. Reeve had done a few sessions before this one, usually alongside Ken Wilkinson, who during this period was mainly still doing mono recordings. However, there were a few sessions where the description on the Charm database seems to suggest that it was a much more collaborative, cooperative way of working between Reeve and Ken Wilkinson. And this includes quite a legendary recording session that had taken place the week before the Shostakovich, and this was the session that led to the Witch's Brew recording for RCA. Now, I haven't got the RCA version, but fortunately in the UK you can get, with a bit of luck, the Decca later production. It's a pretty horrible cover, but Dance Macabre is the same session. It's pretty good quality sound. On eBay it often can command quite huge prices, but it can be picked up if you're lucky. And this one, interestingly, had an original Decca stereo for 99p, and they did sell it to me a few weeks ago for 99p, which was quite good. Ken Wilkinson also within Decca had the role of training up all of the other recording engineers in the techniques involved. Ken Wilkinson might have been present at this session, but certainly by that point in time, Alan Reeve had started to produce very fine sounding stereo recordings. The techniques that were being used for stereo were influenced by the original work by Roy Wallace in Geneva. In both areas there had been a move to change the original M49 directional microphones to a smaller microphone called a KM56, which seemed to produce even more musical results. Things were much more stable from a mono perspective, so I think this led to quite different paths for these two engineers. At the time of this recording, it was far from clear whether stereo was going to be a success. So James Timms was being recruited to learn the established mono techniques, which were producing great results with popular mono records, in case the stereo was a flash in the pan. In contrast, Alan Reeve was there to learn and develop new techniques as they came along, and some of these different styles of recording were utilised and tried out during the period between this recording session and the actual record coming out. The Shostakovich record includes his first symphony and a suite made from a later score from a ballet called The Age of Gold. It was quite an unusual story for a ballet about a Russian sports team going to the USA and quite a lot of political comment, and it wasn't much of an artistic success, but Shostakovich did take out some of the best tunes from the ballet and produced a successful suite. The conductor working with the LSO during this session was Jean Martinon, and this was pretty early on in his career. I think it's fair to say that artistically his later recordings are the most well regarded, but audiophiles do have a lot of affection for the recordings that he made with Decca because it coincided with this quite charming early golden age of stereo recordings. So before talking about the quality of the actual records, we can have a look at these two copies, which, as I said, were produced in the UK. There are some subtle differences between the versions that came out in 59 in the USA. There's, I think probably because we're talking about an age of austerity post-war, they were looking to kind of save money. And the actual photographs do seem to be more a single colour wash rather than the highlights that are present on the RCA version, with things like the makeup on the model stroke ballerina. The UK releases do have the living stereo banner on the bottom rather than the top. It's also monochrome, again probably to save money as far as the speakers. Also, the album covers don't have any spine with writing on the side during this period, which makes life a lot harder as far as storing, but occasionally it does mean that these records are missed in stores where all the records are stored on shelves, and sometimes you do find something that's been overlooked. Now on to the actual vinyl, and as I said, these are Decca pressed versions. The actual dead wax does confirm, because there's a thing called a tax code, that both of these recordings were produced in 59 rather than later versions. Both of these are early pressings, so it does mean that they are of good quality. And going into the really anorak stuff, the actual engineers involved, because there's a separate letter that's used on these recordings. It's pretty easy with the mono record. That letter is an A, which stands for Guy Fletcher, and really he produced pretty much all of the mono records for a very long period, and the quality of his work is very high and very consistent. The actual letter on this stereo recording is an M, which isn't that often seen on Decca records. It seems very likely that the actual engineer involved is a guy called Jimmy Brown, who was also initially the recording engineer assistant for Roy Wallace in the early days of stereo, then went over to do a lot of the stereo recordings in Vienna alongside Gordon Parry. And I think between these sessions he would have other responsibilities, and it certainly seems very plausible that he would have spent some time in London helping out, occasionally doing the mastering engineering. But it is a little bit different in that you've got one very consistent old hand with the mono, and somebody who's more sort of helping out rather than doing this kind of work all of the time. So I spent a fair amount of time listening to both versions, the mono and stereo versions, using different record players. And it was a very enjoyable time because this recording is well recognised as being a classic. I think it's on the TAS list, the Salvatore list. Although I think in both occasions it's the repressings by Classic that are mainly used. However, these original recordings are pretty good, to say the least. My general thoughts are these are both great recordings, but I do think the stereo edges it. I think the stereo, for sheer entertainment value, especially during the suite, and there's a section which is a polka, and the sound stage, the different sections coming in, it's just a lovely listen. And I think the actual quality coming through on parts of the stereo recording, particularly the bass levels, is superior to the mono recording. But you would certainly, if you were a mono fan at the time, you would be very happy with this recording. I do think the stereo version by Alan Reeve fits in with his later repertoire of recordings, all renowned for excelling in stereo transparency and sheer entertainment value. I think the mono recording, it's very competent, it sounds good. I do think that there is a difference between James Timms, who had been taught the mono techniques but was relatively new to them, to some of the mono recordings that I've got by the trio of Gordon Parry, Ken Wilkinson and Gil Wendt, who I think sometimes their late mono recordings can rival, if not excel at points, to the early stereo recordings. But I don't think that is the case in this recording, where, as I said, I think Alan Reeve's stereo recording shades it. But this is still an early incarnation of the stereo recording, and various techniques were later introduced, some of which were adopted, which brought the quality of stereo recording even higher than it was at this particular time. So there have been repressings done of this record, none of which have taken place recently, and it does mean that if you want a high quality early recording such as the Decca or the RCA, or a classic repressing, you're talking about a considerable outlay. I've seen sums like £200-300 in that sort of area. Now with the version that I've got, although it's still got that magical quality, it won't be worth that kind of amount because of the presence of some surface noise. There is an option that can be used, which are RCA repressings released in the UK a few years later and still used the original stampers. And they are definitely more affordable. We're talking about amounts such as in the sort of £30 to £50 range for a good quality one, and that would be probably the most affordable choice if you're looking for potentially getting that kind of tubey magic. The other is the much more budget Eclipse release, which took place I think in the early 70s. They were very good as far as equalization, the quality of the actual cutting heads being used, and we're talking about budget of around £10 or so. So that would be the other area if you wanted to listen to this. But with both of those releases, you're not talking about getting that complete package with the artwork and things like that, which can be a deal breaker, obviously, because the quality of the artwork, photography was all part of the strengths of the RCA Living Stereo releases. This record is quite illustrative of where things had been reached in late 1957. And the period of 18 months before the actual record was pressed did involve further development, which give you a sense of how quickly things were moving on with stereo for Decca and the RCA work that they were also doing. First of all, talking about Ken Wilkinson, a few months after this recording, he got permission from Decca to change over to stereo, and this led to him dominating the stereo sessions in London, particularly at Kingsway Hall. Ken Wilkinson also worked in 1958 doing some stereo in Paris. He took responsibility for setting up the separate mono and stereo setups, probably because he could do the mono setup in his sleep by then. But it probably was quite tiring, because the Charm database does indicate that James Timms did come over for a later session to take charge of the mono recordings, while Wilkinson in Paris just did the stereo. James Timms did stick with mono recordings, and the quality was consistent. He was recruited in 1958 to work in the spring and autumn sessions of recording in the absence of Gil Wendt, who was unavailable for at least 1 year. This involves some pretty prestigious sessions, including Ansa May doing the whole of the Nutcracker and the Swan Lake recordings. In the end, though, the mono recordings were consistent, they were popular, but there was no real development required. With Wilkinson moving over to stereo, and the other development, the purchasing of the Argo subsidiary, Alan Reeve was called in to do some of the initial stereo and mono recordings on the Argo label. So he did choral historical religious works in quite challenging settings, learning the ropes of how to do good quality recordings in cathedrals and chapels such as some of the Cambridge University chapels. And this is an example of one of his recordings, which I picked up because they're not, the actual stereo recordings are pretty rare in contrast to the mono, but because this sort of area just isn't popular, you can get some really cheap ones. I think this is an original 1959 mint Argo. I think I got it for £2. It was an interesting listen. I mean, I think on side 2 of this is the work of Orlando Gibbons, and I'd never heard of him. However, the end of side 2, this is the record of John, which involves Thurston Dart, Desmond Dupre on treble and tenor viols, which is more of a strings bass in a chapel setup. It's magical. It really is lovely. But but obviously not really that popular. But occasionally Alan Reeve did get the opportunity to work again in Kingsway Hall, and there's a few examples over here. Quite soon after the Age of Gold session, there was an interesting one involving John Coleshaw, the sort of head producer who had overall managerial responsibility for artistic decisions of what they were going to go for Decca, and what they actually tried out with a session that involved the session that involved the Sibelius violin concerto and Kirsten Flagstad. They'd set up, similar to Roy Wallace's approach to L'Enfant des Sortilèges, a second Decca tree, and this Decca tree was used just for a solo singer or for a solo violin. It never really took off. I mean, it is interesting to hear the Sibelius violin concerto with that awareness that they were using a whole Decca tree rather than a spot microphone. It does come over as a slightly more vivid, but using a second Decca tree it does feel like overkill in contrast to how Roy Wallace used it for a whole collection of singers. As far as I'm aware, a Decca tree can sometimes be used for a drum kit or something like that, where there's a more of a spatial setup of different sounds, but with an individual, it's not really the case. James Timms and Alan Reeve did work together as mono and stereo with the Schubert song cycle over there, but and that was with John Coleshaw. And it was interesting at that particular point in 1958, with John Coleshaw having so much influence and power. It's interesting that at that particular point in 1958, he worked just with the mono team. Above here, we've got the Monter, Ravel, Daphnis and Chloe, very prestigious recording that was carried out in spring 1959, that John Coleshaw was now allocated to the stereo team. This was a very significant change in team, but there was also, by that point, a very significant change in technology. In 1958, Ken Wilkinson had started using a technique using outriggers. There were two additional microphones utilised to help out the Decca tree. They were usually situated on the far left and far right of the orchestra, and the type of microphones that we used were omnidirectional microphones, such as the M50, which was a microphone beloved of Ken Wilkinson. The outriggers were introduced to address the shortcomings of the Decca tree, which tended to not pick up as well the whole atmosphere of the venue, which was really meant to be Decca's USP, but also was very useful. They were very useful in picking up some of the quieter instruments in the section, which were perhaps missed because they were not as close to the Decca tree. The outriggers were used by Ken Wilkinson when recording Monter with Elgar's Enigma variations, and they really were useful for large-scale recordings. And when Alan Reeve came to do the stereo recording of the Ravel, which was a massive orchestra, it was over 100 members for that recording, he also used the outriggers. And this recording, the length of the music recorded, the sheer volume really indicated that in the spring 1959 they were really pushing the envelope as far as stereo recordings. This is a great recording that possibly comes into its element with later repressings. the actual version I've got is a Ted Burkett mastered record, and his skills were very much required to really get all of that record on vinyl. I have got mono and stereo versions of the recording of Monteur doing Daphnis and Chloe, and there is a greater difference. I do think the stereo recording, this is 18 months later than the Shostakovich. It's again, the mono is very good, but the stereo version it's an event. It's on a different level, and we're talking about a very gifted engineer who just had a natural grasp for stereo recording, and utilised Ken Wilkinson's lessons really well. Although Ken Wilkinson did collaborate with quite a few different recording engineers with great results, there is something special when on the recordings that Alan Reeve and Ken Wilkinson have produced. They really are the dynamic duo, and one of the later shootouts that I'm going to cover is one of these collaborations, and I'll probably talk about the later collaborations from the 1960s, because Alan Reeve, he is no way near as prolific as Ken Wilkinson, but every now and then he pops up with an absolute brilliant recording, either by himself or these recordings with Ken Wilkinson that are just fantastic. So I guess that's a little bit of an advert for one of the later shootouts, because we get to revisit this brilliant engineer, Alan Reeve. As far as James Timms, it's one of the things, I mean, Decca was doing exactly the right thing. They were hedging their bets at this particular point in time, because it was far from clear whether stereo was just going to be a flash in the pan. It was very important that Decca did ensure an investment in future technology, but didn't neglect the quality of the mono recordings, which were of an extremely high quality at this time and world renowned. So I hope you've enjoyed this rather deep dive into the shootout, and also this overview of what was happening with stereo at this particular time. It was an enjoyable chance to listen in detail repeatedly to these two great recordings. So the next two records that I've got lined up with vintage stereo and mono versions will continue this story, and also include some other great recordings. So I hope to see you again. Bye.